So now we've seen how to actually get data from our collection and show that data on the page. The next step is to save data to the database using this form right here. So in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is attach an event listener to this form to listen for the submit event. So let's do that first of all. We need a reference to the form, which is right here. It doesn't have an ID or class, but it is the only form on the page. So we can say const form is equal to document.query selector. I'm not sure I've spelled this correctly. Yes, I have. And then we want the form. So now we have a reference to that form. Down here, underneath where we get the documents, I'm going to do a new comment to say add documents. And we need to attach an event listener, first of all, to the form. So we'll say form.add event listener. And the event we want to listen to is the submit event. Now, when this happens, we fire a callback function and we are going to take in the event object as a parameter. So the first thing we need to do is prevent the default action. E.prevent default does that. That stops the page from reloading. Then the next thing I want to do is say const now is equal to a new date. Now, why am I doing this? We're getting the date, the exact time that a user is submitting this form. And I'm doing that because over in the collection, we store the created at property right here, which is a timestamp. So that is when the recipe was added. So that's why I need to get the date now so we know when this recipe was added, and we're storing it in this variable right here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is construct some kind of object that represents this recipe. Remember, when we talked about documents inside this collection, we talked of these as objects because they have key value pairs. Now, when we actually save a document to this Firestore database, what we do is we actually pass it a JavaScript object, and it takes that JavaScript object and it saves it as a document. So our JavaScript object is going to have to look something like this, where we have an author property, a created at property, which is a Firebase timestamp, and also a title property. So let's create an object that looks like that and call it recipe. So we'll say const recipe and set this equal to an object. Now inside that object, we need those three different properties. So I'm going to say title is whatever a user types in. Now that is from this input field right here. Now, if we have a look at that in the HTML, this has an ID of recipe. So what we could say is form, which is the reference from the form, dot recipe, which is the ID of the input field. Remember, we can do this to get a reference on that field. Then we want the value from that field. So that gets us the value they type in. The next thing we need is the created at property, and that is going to be this thing right here. However, we don't just want to pass a date to this thing right here because this is a Firestore timestamp. It's different from a date. It's a special object in Firestore. So how do we create one of those from a date? Well, the way we do that is by first accessing the Firebase object from the Firebase library. Remember, we have access to that because we load it in right here. Then on that, we're going to say .firestore to access the Firestore library. Then we want a timestamp, and that is a capital T. And then we want that from a date. So we use a method called from date, and then we pass in the date that we want this from, and that is this thing right here. So I can just pass in now, and that creates a timestamp object for us based on this date. So when we're storing this now, it's going to store a timestamp object as the created at property. Now then, the other property over here was author. Now, we don't actually technically need this because we're not outputting the author anywhere. And actually, when we save something to a collection like this, we don't actually need to specify all of the properties. If we don't specify them, it will just leave it empty. So we can just specify these two and have done with it. Okay, so now we have that recipe object. The next thing to do is go out and get a reference again to this collection, recipes, because that's where we want to add the document to. So we'll say DB, which is our database reference. Then we'll say dot collection, which is a method to get a collection. We want the recipes collection. Then once we have that, we use a method called add. And this method is what we use to add a new document to a collection. Now, what do we pass in here? Well, we pass in a JavaScript object that represents that document, and we just created that right here. It's called recipe. So let's pass in that object. So this again is asynchronous. It takes some time to do, and it's going to return a promise which will resolve or reject at some point. So we can tack on the .then method, which will fire a callback function when it's done. Now we're not going to take in any parameter here because we're not trying to get data from the database. We just want to fire this when the recipe has been added. And all we'll say is console.log recipe added at this point, just so that we know as a developer that this recipe has now been added to the database. At the end, we're going to tack on a .catch method just in case there is an error, and we'll take that error into a callback function and log that to the console. So we'll say console.log and error. Okay, so now let's give this a whirl. Hopefully this will work. When we submit the form, prevent the default action, create the new date, create the recipe object based on the value they type in, and a timestamp object, and then we're accessing the recipes collection, adding that new recipe, and then when this is done, we're firing this to the console. So let me save it and go over here. Now we're going to add a new recipe. So I'll just call this a vegan pie and press add, and we get an error. And that's because I've stupidly called it Cathsy instead of catch. So I don't know why I always do this. Let me save that again and refresh. Now, even though we got an error, we can see this still added to the database. Let me do another one. I'm going to say veggie curry and save that. And now we can see recipe added. But notice that we don't automatically see it over here. We have to now refresh the page to get that. But before we do, let's go to the database and we can see the 4 documents in here now that we've added. So this did all work over here when we got the value and we got the timestamp, then we added it to that collection. That all worked, and we can see those documents over here. If I just get one of the new ones, we can see vegan pie and this timestamp, and we can see veggie curry and this timestamp as well. So that works, but it doesn't automatically show over here, and that's because when we get the documents, that is at the start of the page load. That is when we get it, when we first run this file. So when we add a new document down here, we're not automatically then going out and getting the documents again. We're only doing that at the start. So to see it, we're going to have to refresh the page, and now we see the veggie curry as well. So we are going to combat this later when we look at real-time updates, but before we do that, I want to show you also how to delete documents from the database as well.